Poor elderly gardener accidentally damages rare sculpture at a wealthy estate and is immediately fired and was sued for damages. But when the millionaire finds out who he is. Before we dive into the story, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe so you won't miss the next stories. Now, let's get into it. Mr. Harold had always treated the garden like his own masterpiece. Each shrub, every flower bed, and the neat gravel paths bore the imprint of his care. For over 30 years, he'd worked under the rising sun and through rainy afternoons, his hands roughened by seasons of pruning and planting. To Harold, the sprawling estate was more than a job, it was a part of his soul. But lately, the whispers of doubt had grown louder in his mind. His joints ached more than they used to, and though he rarely let it show, climbing ladders or carrying heavy bags of mulch left him more winded than before. Harold knew that time was catching up to him. The whispers, however, weren't just in his head. Ms. Delacroix, the estate's sharp-eyed property manager, had taken to watching him with the kind of scrutiny that left him uneasy. She had a way of appearing silently behind him as he worked, her arms crossed and her lips drawn in a thin line, as though she was waiting for him to slip up. "The estate demands perfection, Harold," she had said more than once, her tone laced with condescension. "And perfection requires energy, focus. You understand, don't you?" Harold understood perfectly. Ms. Delacroix didn't think much of him. To her, he was just an old man clinging to a role that should have gone to someone younger, someone faster. The other staff whispered about her, too, though never in her presence. They called her cold, ruthless, a perfectionist with no room for mistakes. But Harold, ever the optimist, had hoped his years of loyalty would count for something. He had hoped she would see his dedication rather than his age. What Harold didn't know was that Ms. Delacroix had been contemplating his dismissal for months. To her, his value as a gardener had dwindled. She didn't see the care in the way he trimmed the hedges or the patience in how he coaxed life from the soil. She saw inefficiency. Fresh blood, she had mused during one of her many calls with the agency that provided temporary staff. Someone who can keep up with the demands of an estate of this size. The estate's owner, a wealthy and enigmatic man, was indifferent to such matters. To him, the estate was an occasional retreat, a place he visited once or twice a year for business meetings or private gatherings. He had long ago entrusted all decisions about its upkeep to Ms. Delacroix, confident in her judgment and uninterested in the finer details of its day-to-day management. If she wanted to replace Harold, he would hardly notice, let alone intervene. On a crisp morning, the sun filtered softly through the trees, casting dappled light across the estate's manicured lawns. Harold was trimming a hedge near the main walkway, his movements slow but deliberate. Beside him stood a tall, ornate sculpture, a centerpiece commissioned years ago by the estate's owner. Harold had always admired the craftsmanship, though he treated it with the same casual reverence he gave all parts of the garden. Balancing on his ladder, Harold reached for a stray branch just out of his grasp. He shifted his weight ever so slightly, and in that moment, his foot slipped. The ladder wobbled, scraping against the gravel, and Harold instinctively grabbed for the nearest solid object. His heart leapt as his hand brushed against the cold marble of the sculpture. The ladder steadied, but the sculpture did not. Time seemed to slow as Harold watched the sculpture teeter, its weight shifting ominously. He reached out, desperate to steady it, but his fingers barely grazed its edge. With a heart-stopping crash, the sculpture toppled to the ground, shattering into an unforgiving mess of shards and dust. Harold froze, the sound of the impact echoing through the still morning air. His hands trembled as he descended the ladder, his face pale. Panic bubbled in his chest as he knelt beside the fragments. The intricate details of the sculpture, once so masterfully carved, were now reduced to rubble. Harold's mind raced. What would Ms. Delacroix say? What would she do? He could already hear her sharp voice, her cutting remarks. "I'm finished," he muttered to himself, his voice barely audible. "This is it." And then, as if summoned by the commotion, Ms. Delacroix appeared. The sharp clatter of Ms. Delacroix's heels reverberated as she approached the scene. Her face, already set in stern lines, darkened when her gaze fell on the shattered sculpture. She halted abruptly, her arms crossing in a way that seemed to cut through the chilly morning air. The staff that had gathered at the edges of the commotion fell silent, their gazes flitting between Harold and their steely manager. "What," she began, her voice a low hiss, "have you done?" Harold, standing amidst the jagged marble fragments, could barely meet her eyes. His hands, roughened from years of pruning and planting, shook as he tried to explain. "Ms. Delacroix, it was an accident. I was trimming the hedge, and the ladder." "Enough," she snapped, her tone slicing through his words. She gestured sharply to the broken pieces. "This sculpture was one of a kind. Do you have any idea how much this is worth? Do you realize the damage you've caused?" "I didn't mean to," Harold stammered, but Ms. Delacroix raised a hand, silencing him with an air of finality. "You didn't mean to," she echoed mockingly. "Is that supposed to fix this?" "This is exactly what I've been warning about, Harold. Your age, your carelessness, it was only a matter of time before something like this happened." Harold felt the words like a physical blow. He opened his mouth to plead, but Ms. Delacroix continued, her voice cold and unwavering. "You've been on borrowed time here. I've overlooked your limitations out of respect for your years of service, but this is unforgivable. You are finished here. Gather your things and leave. Now." The gathered staff exchanged uneasy glances, but no one dared to speak. Harold's throat tightened. He wanted to argue, to defend himself, but the truth was, Ms. Delacroix's words echoed the doubts he'd been battling for months. For a moment, he stood rooted to the spot, unable to move. Then, slowly, he nodded, his shoulders slumping as he turned to walk away. The garden, his life's work, blurred in his vision as tears threatened to spill. Behind him, Ms. Delacroix pulled out her phone, already making calls to inform the estate staff of Harold's dismissal. Her voice was brisk, businesslike, as though she were merely crossing another item off her to-do list. For Harold, the walk back to the gardener's shed was the longest he had ever taken. Each step felt heavier than the last, the weight of the shattered sculpture pressing down on him like a physical burden. When he finally reached the shed, he closed the door behind him and let out a shuddering breath. Harold packed his tools with trembling hands, his mind replaying the events in an endless loop. The garden had been his life's work, a place he had poured his heart and soul into, and now he was being cast out like a worn-out tool. As he left the grounds for what he thought would be the last time, Harold couldn't bring himself to look back. The only thing he could focus on was the gnawing question in his mind: what would he tell Melissa? As he neared home, the sight of his modest cottage brought little comfort. He hesitated on the porch, steeling himself for what he knew would be the hardest part, facing Melissa. He pushed the door open, and the familiar scent of coffee and the faint hum of a radio greeted him. Melissa was in the kitchen, her brow furrowed as she went over a stack of bills. She looked up and smiled faintly, but her expression shifted to concern when she saw her father's face. "Dad? What's wrong?" she asked, setting down the papers and crossing the room to him. Harold hesitated, his voice catching in his throat. I lost my job." Melissa's eyes widened. "What? Why? What happened?" He lowered himself into a chair, the weight of the morning pressing down on him. "It was an accident," he began. "I was trimming the hedge near the big sculpture, and the ladder slipped. It fell, Melissa. The sculpture, it's destroyed." Melissa's mouth fell open. "Oh no. Dad, I'm so sorry." Ms. Delacroix didn't want to hear a word of it. "She fired me on the spot," Harold said, his voice breaking. 30 years, and that's how it ends." Melissa placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. "You've given that place your everything, Dad. This isn't fair." "It doesn't matter what's fair," Harold said bitterly. "It's done." The silence that followed was heavy. Melissa knew her father had been struggling to keep up with the physical demands of the job, but she also knew how much the garden meant to him. To see him so defeated broke her heart. Their financial struggles, already a constant worry, loomed larger now. Harold's income, while modest, had been essential. Melissa, juggling 2 jobs and raising her young son, Liam, was already stretched thin. Losing Harold's contribution to their household left a gap they couldn't afford to ignore. Melissa glanced at the pile of bills on the counter, a wave of anxiety washing over her. Rent, utilities, groceries, it all felt like an insurmountable mountain. But she couldn't let her father see her worry. He already looked crushed enough. "We'll figure it out," she said softly, trying to keep her voice steady. "We always do." Harold looked at her, his eyes filled with guilt. "I should have been more careful. I should have." "Stop," Melissa interrupted firmly. "You're human, Dad. Accidents happen. This isn't your fault." He gave her a weak nod, but his expression didn't change. Harold wasn't just mourning the loss of his job, he was mourning the part of himself that had been tied to the estate for so many years. It wasn't just work, it was a connection to his identity, to his sense of purpose. And now, that connection was severed. As the day wore on, Melissa tried to keep her father distracted, encouraging him to rest and eat, but his appetite was gone. He sat by the window, staring out at the small garden they had tended together, his thoughts a whirlwind of regret and worry. By evening, Melissa found herself alone in the kitchen, her hands gripping the counter as she fought back tears. She had to be strong for her father, for Liam, but the weight of their situation felt unbearable. How could she stretch their already limited resources to cover what they'd lost? And more importantly, how could she help her father find peace after such a devastating blow? Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of Harold's chair scraping against the floor. He shuffled into the kitchen, his eyes tired. "Melissa," he said quietly. "I want to help. I can't just sit here while you're doing everything." "You're not a burden, Dad," she replied. "You've done more for this family than I can ever repay. Right now, I just need you to take care of yourself." "I don't know if I can," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Melissa's heart ached at his words, but she pushed her feelings aside. She reached out and squeezed his hand. "One step at a time. We'll get through this." As the night deepened, Harold sat in his room, staring at a faded photograph of the estate's garden in its early days. He had been so proud of what he'd built there. Now, all he could feel was loss. In the next room, Melissa stared at her computer screen, searching desperately for solutions, her mind racing with worry but her resolve unshaken. The days following Harold's dismissal weighed heavily on him, each one more difficult than the last. He spent hours sitting in his worn armchair by the window, staring out at the small, untidy garden he and Melissa had cultivated. It was a shadow of the grand estate he had once nurtured, and every glance reminded him of what he had lost. His appetite dwindled to nearly nothing, meals left untouched despite Melissa's gentle encouragement. Nights were no better. He tossed and turned, the shame of his abrupt firing gnawing at him, the sound of the shattered sculpture replaying in his mind like a cruel echo. Melissa watched her father fade, a shadow of the proud, dedicated man she had always known. The fire in his eyes, the one that had driven him to rise before dawn each morning to tend the gardens, seemed to have gone out. It broke her heart to see him so lost. She tried everything she could think of, leaving his favorite snacks on the table, playing old songs on the radio, even inviting Liam to show him his latest school projects, but nothing seemed to lift his spirits. Late one night, as Harold shuffled past the kitchen, Melissa gently stopped him. "Dad, you need to eat something. I made soup." "I'm not hungry," he murmured, avoiding her gaze. She stepped closer, her voice soft but firm. "This isn't like you. You've always been so strong. What happened at the estate was unfair, but it doesn't define you. You're so much more than that job." Harold sighed, his shoulders slumping under the weight of her words. "Melissa, it wasn't just a job. It was my purpose. I gave that place everything I had. And now," he trailed off, shaking his head, "I don't know who I am without it." Melissa felt a lump rise in her throat but forced herself to stay composed. "You're my dad. Liam's grandfather. You're the heart of this family, and we need you." She hesitated, then added, "And I think it's time someone else understood that too." The next morning, Melissa pulled on her coat and set out for the estate. She didn't tell Harold where she was going. He would only worry or try to stop her, but she was determined to make Ms. Delacroix understand what her decision had done to him. The drive to the estate felt longer than usual, the tension building with each mile. By the time she arrived, her hands were trembling, though she wasn't sure if it was from nerves or anger. The estate loomed ahead, its grandeur undiminished by Harold's absence. The gardens still looked immaculate, the hedges trimmed and the flowers vibrant. But to Melissa, the place felt colder, emptier, as if Harold's touch had truly been what gave it life. Ms. Delacroix was in her office when Melissa was shown in, seated at her desk with the air of someone who had no time for interruptions. She looked up briefly, her sharp eyes narrowing. "Miss Carter," she said, her tone brisk. "To what do I owe this visit?" Melissa took a steadying breath. "I'm here to talk about my father." Ms. Delacroix's lips twitched into something resembling a smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. "I assumed as much. Let me save you some time. Your father's dismissal was final. I won't be reversing it." Melissa stood her ground, her voice calm but resolute. "I'm not asking you to undo what happened. I'm asking you to reconsider. My father gave 30 years of his life to this estate. He cared for it like it was his own, and I think he deserves better than to be cast aside over one mistake." Ms. Delacroix leaned back in her chair, her expression hardening. "One mistake," she repeated, her tone dripping with disdain. "Your father destroyed a priceless sculpture, Ms. Carter. A mistake of that magnitude has consequences." Melissa clenched her fists, trying to keep her frustration in check. "It was an accident. He didn't mean to." "It doesn't matter what he meant," Ms. Delacroix interrupted sharply. "What matters is the result. And quite frankly, his age and declining abilities made this inevitable. I've been lenient with him for far too long." The words hit Melissa like a slap, but she refused to back down. "You're not being fair. He's been nothing but loyal, and he worked harder than anyone else on this estate. You know that." Ms. Delacroix's expression darkened further. "I know that your father is no longer suited for the demands of this job. And I know that your interference isn't helping him." Melissa felt a flash of anger. Interference? I'm standing up for my father because someone needs to. You've made him feel worthless, and it's killing him. For a moment, Ms. Delacroix said nothing, her gaze icy and unyielding. Then she reached into a folder on her desk and pulled out a piece of paper, sliding it across to Melissa. If you want to talk about consequences, you should see this. I've filed a lawsuit against your father for the cost of the sculpture. Perhaps that will help you understand the gravity of the situation. Melissa stared at the paper, her breath catching. A lawsuit, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. You're suing him? Of course, Ms. Delacroix replied, her tone matter-of-fact. That sculpture was irreplaceable, and someone needs to be held accountable. The words hung in the air, heavy and cruel. Melissa felt a mix of shock, anger, and helplessness as she realized the full extent of Ms. Delacroix's disdain for her father. This wasn't just about the sculpture, it was about her prejudice, her belief that Harold was no longer valuable because of his age. You're doing this because you don't like him, Melissa said, her voice trembling. Because you think he's too old, too slow. This isn't about the estate. This is personal. Ms. Delacroix's eyes narrowed. Be very careful with your accusations, Ms. Carter. Your father's actions speak for themselves. Melissa didn't reply. Her heart pounded as she turned and left the office, the weight of the lawsuit pressing down on her like a storm cloud. The drive home was a blur, her mind racing with questions and fears. How could they possibly fight this? How could she tell her father that things had just gotten worse? When she walked through the door, Harold was in his usual spot by the window, his gaze distant. He looked up as she entered, his expression heavy with worry. Melissa, he said softly. Where were you? She hesitated, then sat down beside him. I went to talk to Ms. Delacroix. I thought maybe I could convince her to give you your job back. Harold's eyes widened slightly. And? Melissa swallowed hard. She's not budging. And there's more. She's suing you for the cost of the sculpture. The color drained from Harold's face. He looked away, his hands gripping the armrests of his chair. I can't fight this, Melissa. You don't have to, she said quickly, her voice firm. We'll figure it out. I won't let her do this to you. But as the evening stretched on and the weight of the news settled over them, Melissa couldn't ignore the worsening pallor of her father's face or the deepening lines of worry etched into his features. She knew they couldn't fight this alone, but she didn't yet know how to save him from the pain he was carrying. The envelope arrived late in the day, as though it knew its contents would only bring more darkness to their evening. Harold sat at the kitchen table, the weight of the notice heavy in his hand before he even opened it. When the words finally stared back at him, his expression broke. The lawsuit wasn't just a threat, it was official. The amount Ms. Delacroix was demanding wasn't just steep, it was insurmountable. Harold pressed a trembling hand to his forehead, his other clutching the paper tightly. Melissa entered the room, her arms full of grocery bags, pausing when she saw her father hunched over the table. Dad? What's wrong? She asked, setting the bags down. He handed her the notice without a word, his head bowed. Melissa read it quickly, her face hardening with disbelief. She filed the lawsuit? Her voice rose, a mix of anger and shock. What is wrong with that woman? She's right, Harold muttered, his voice low. I broke it. It's my fault. No, Melissa snapped, her tone sharp. She's taking this too far. This isn't about the sculpture. This is about her trying to humiliate you because she doesn't think you're good enough anymore. Harold didn't answer. His silence, heavy with defeat, filled the room. Melissa clenched the paper in her hands, fury coursing through her. This wasn't just unfair, it was cruel. They couldn't afford to fight this. Ms. Delacroix knew that, which made her actions all the more vindictive. That night, as Harold slept fitfully in his room, Melissa sat at her computer, her frustration pushing her to dig deeper. She knew Ms. Delacroix was behind this, but Ms. Delacroix wasn't the real power at the estate. Somewhere, there was an owner, a person with the authority to stop this madness. The problem was, this owner seemed more like a ghost. Melissa scoured public records and estate filings, searching for any hint of the person who held the purse strings. Everything led back to the same corporate entity, Cartwright Holdings. A bland, faceless name with no photo, no direct mention of an actual human being behind it. She found mentions of an art collection, references to real estate ventures, and charity work attributed to the organization, but nothing that pointed to an individual. It was maddening. How could someone have so much control and yet remain so invisible? The estate's wealth had to belong to someone, a person who could surely step in and end this nightmare. But the more she searched, the more she realized how carefully the owner had shielded themselves. Every lead circled back to the same opaque system of managers, agents, and automated contact forms. As the hours dragged on, her determination grew sharper. Someone had to care. Someone at the top had to understand how unjust this was. Finally, she stumbled across an old corporate email buried in an outdated directory, info@cartwrightholdings.com. It wasn't much, but it was something, a thread she could follow. And to her surprise, there was one additional email listed beneath it, h.cartwright@. It was almost too generic to believe, but it felt closer, like a crack in the carefully constructed wall around this mystery owner. Melissa leaned back in her chair, her thoughts racing. She didn't have a name, a face, or a guarantee that anyone would even read her message. But she had no other choice. With a deep breath, she began to type, pouring her heart into the email, making sure every word counted. Dear Sir or Madam, I'm writing to you as a last resort, not for pity but because I believe you deserve to know what's happening at your estate. My name is Melissa Carter, and my father, Harold, was your gardener for over 30 years. He took care of the grounds as if they were his own, working tirelessly to make them beautiful. You've probably never met him, all communication from the estate has come through Ms. Delacroix, but he dedicated his life to your property. A few weeks ago, my father had an accident. While trimming a hedge, he accidentally knocked over one of the sculptures. It was destroyed, and Ms. Delacroix fired him on the spot. That was devastating enough, but now she's filed a lawsuit against him, demanding repayment for the sculpture's cost. My father is 70 years old. He doesn't have the resources to fight this, and the stress has taken a serious toll on his health. I understand that the sculpture was valuable, but I'm asking you to consider this situation with compassion. My father is a good man who made one mistake after years of loyal service. This lawsuit feels unnecessarily cruel, especially since the sculpture may have been insured. Please, if you have the ability to intervene, I'm begging you to reconsider what's happening. I've attached a photo of my father and me, so you can see the people this decision is affecting. We're not asking for charity, just fairness. Sincerely, Melissa Carter. Melissa attached the photo, one of her and Harold standing side by side in their modest backyard. She hesitated for a moment, her mouse hovering over the send button. Once she clicked it, there would be no turning back. She didn't know who would read it, or if it would even make a difference. But she had to try. With a final deep breath, she clicked send. The email disappeared into the digital void, and Melissa sat back, staring at the screen. She didn't know what would come of it, but at least she had taken a step. Somewhere out there, someone with the power to change everything had just received her plea. Henry Cartwright sat in his expansive study, the faint hum of the city audible through the half-open window. His laptop screen glowed softly in the dim light, a long list of emails demanding his attention. Most were routine, updates from his staff, financial reports, offers from art collectors. He scanned the subject lines without much interest, his hand moving reflexively to his coffee cup. One email, titled "A Plea for My Father," caught his eye. With a sigh, Henry clicked it open, his intention already forming. Another appeal for help, he thought. Likely someone looking for him to bend a rule or cover an expense. He skimmed the first few lines, the words blending into the noise of his other obligations. "Dear Mr. Cartwright, I'm writing to you as a last resort." The tone was heartfelt, perhaps too heartfelt, he thought. He'd seen this kind of email before, long on emotion and short on practicality. His finger hovered over the forward button, ready to send it to his legal team for them to handle. But as he prepared to click, a name jumped out at him, Melissa Carter. His hand froze. Melissa Carter. The name seemed to echo in his mind, stirring something buried deep in his memory. It couldn't be, could it? The email's content faded into the background as his pulse quickened. He clicked on the attachment at the bottom of the message, a single photo file. The image loaded slowly, and the moment it appeared, Henry felt the air leave his lungs. It was her. She was older now, of course, with subtle lines around her eyes and a maturity that hadn't been there before. But it was unmistakably Melissa, the same Melissa who had once held his heart in her hands. In the photo, she stood beside an elderly man, her father, he realized. The man looked worn but proud, his arm resting gently on Melissa's shoulder. She was smiling, though her expression carried a hint of sadness, of quiet resolve. For a long moment, Henry stared at the photo, the rest of the world fading away. His mind flooded with memories of summers long past, of late-night walks and laughter that echoed like music. Melissa Carter. He hadn't spoken her name in years, hadn't allowed himself to dwell on the chapter of his life she had once dominated. She had been his first love, the kind that left a mark too deep to ever fully heal. Decades ago, they had been inseparable. He could still picture her sitting beside him on the steps of her family's modest home, her eyes sparkling as they talked about the future. She had dreams of traveling, of seeing the world beyond their small town, and Henry had shared her excitement. They had made promises, whispered in the glow of fireflies, to always stay connected, no matter what life brought. But life had brought distance. Her family had moved suddenly, and his letters had gone unanswered. Slowly, painfully, he had accepted that their paths had diverged. He had buried his feelings beneath the layers of a busy life, convincing himself that some loves simply weren't meant to last. And yet, here she was. Henry exhaled deeply, running a hand through his hair as he tore his gaze away from the photo and reread the email with new focus. Melissa's words painted a vivid picture of her father, Harold, a man who had devoted decades to Henry's estate only to be discarded after a single mistake. Fired and now facing a lawsuit, Harold's plight was clear, and Melissa's plea for compassion rang with sincerity. Henry felt a pang of guilt. How could this have happened under his watch? He had entrusted the management of his properties to capable hands, or so he had thought. Had he been so detached, so focused on his own world, that he had allowed such cruelty to unfold? Ms. Delacroix was meticulous, but had she gone too far? And had his own inattention made him complicit? He returned to the photo, his eyes drawn to Melissa's face. The years had changed them both, but in her expression, he could still see traces of the girl who had once made him believe in forever. Her words, coupled with the image, stirred something he couldn't ignore. This wasn't just a letter from a stranger. It was a connection to a past he thought was lost. And whether it was fate or chance that had brought her back into his life, Henry knew he couldn't brush this off. Not this time. Not her. Closing his laptop, he leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. What was he supposed to do now? This wasn't a simple matter of resolving an issue at one of his properties. This was personal. And for the first time in years, Henry felt the tug of something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a long time: hope, tangled with uncertainty and an ache he couldn't name. The black car pulled into the gravel driveway, its polished exterior gleaming against the simplicity of the small, weathered house. Inside the car, Henry Cartwright gripped the steering wheel tightly, his jaw clenched. He had been preparing for this moment since the email, but now, sitting there in the silence, he wasn't sure if he was ready. The house told a story of its own. The chipped paint, the creaking porch swing hanging askew, and the flower beds that looked like they had once been vibrant but were now overrun with weeds. It was clear that life here hadn't been easy. Henry's chest tightened. What had Melissa's life been like? He imagined her sitting on that swing, perhaps with a cup of coffee, her laughter filling the air as it had so many years ago. The thought was bittersweet. He hadn't seen her in decades, yet she had remained a constant presence in his memories, a reminder of what could have been. He exhaled deeply, his fingers loosening from the wheel. This wasn't about him. It was about her father. About fixing the injustice that had unfolded under his watch. But he couldn't deny the anticipation, or the fear, that coursed through him. Would she recognize him? And if she did, how would she react? He wasn't the same man she had known, and she was no longer the girl he had fallen in love with. Life had changed them both. Pushing the thoughts aside, Henry opened the door and stepped out. He adjusted his suit jacket, his polished demeanor momentarily faltering as he took a hesitant step toward the house. In the yard, a woman stood with her back to him, tending to a small planter. The angle of her shoulders, the way she moved, it was unmistakable. Melissa. His heart thudded, the years collapsing in an instant. Melissa Carter, he called, his voice steady but carrying a note of hesitation. She froze. Slowly, she straightened and turned toward him, wiping her hands on a rag. Her expression shifted from curiosity to confusion, then to something sharper. Henry felt his breath catch. She was older now, the youthful light in her face replaced by something more resilient, more grounded. But it was her. He would have recognized her anywhere. Yes, she said cautiously. Who are you? He took a step closer, his throat dry. It's Henry. Henry Cartwright. The moment the words left his mouth, he saw the realization dawn on her face. Her eyes widened, and she took a small step back, the name hitting her like a shockwave. Henry Cartwright, she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. H. Cartwright. Oh my God. Her gaze darted over him, the pieces clicking into place. You, she said, her voice rising. You're him? The owner of the estate? The one suing my father? The one who let all this happen? Henry held up his hands, his voice gentle. Melissa, wait. Let me explain. Explain? She snapped, her tone sharp with disbelief. What is there to explain? You let your manager fire my father after 30 years. 30 years. And then you have the nerve to sue him? And now you show up here, what, to rub salt in the wound? No, Henry said quickly, his tone pleading. That's not why I'm here. I didn't know, Melissa. I didn't know any of this was happening. Her laugh was bitter, her eyes narrowing. You didn't know? You own the estate. You hired Ms. Delacroix. You're telling me you just handed her the keys and didn't bother to check how she was treating the people who worked for you? Henry's shoulders sagged under the weight of her words. Yes, he admitted. I trusted her. I trusted that she would handle things fairly. I was wrong, Melissa. I failed. And when I found out, when I saw your email, I knew I had to make it right. She stared at him, her emotions a storm of anger, disbelief, and something deeper, something unspoken. Make it right, she repeated, her voice trembling. How do you even begin to fix this? My father is 70 years old, Henry. He's been sick, losing sleep, thinking about this lawsuit every single day. How do you fix that? Henry took a step closer, his voice softening. I'm dropping the lawsuit. Effective immediately. And Ms. Delacroix is gone. I fired her. Melissa blinked, the words taking a moment to register. You fired her? Yes, he said firmly. What she did was unacceptable. She doesn't represent the values I want for the estate, or for myself. Her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her expression guarded. And what about my father? What about the 30 years he gave to that estate? What happens to him? Henry hesitated, the weight of her question pressing down on him. I can't undo the past, he said finally. But I can try to make amends. I want to compensate him for everything he's been through. And, if he's willing, I'd like to offer him his job back. Melissa's jaw tightened, her emotions shifting too quickly to pin down. The offer sounded genuine, but the pain of the last few weeks, the betrayal she felt, wasn't so easily soothed. This doesn't change the fact that you let it happen, she said quietly. You let someone else make decisions that hurt people, Henry. That's not the man I used to know. Henry flinched at her words, his gaze dropping to the ground. I know, he said softly. I lost my way, Melissa. I got caught up in everything, the business, the responsibilities. I let myself drift from the things that mattered. And when I saw your email, I realized how much I've let slip through my fingers. Her breath caught, a flicker of memory passing between them. The boy she had loved, the one who had whispered dreams of forever on warm summer nights, stood before her now as a man who had become almost a stranger. But beneath the polished suit and the mistakes, she could see traces of the person he had once been. For a moment, they stood in silence, the weight of their shared past and present hanging between them. Finally, Melissa stepped back, her voice quieter but no less firm. My father is inside. You can talk to him. But don't expect this to be easy, Henry. He nodded again, his expression a mixture of gratitude and resolve. Thank you, Melissa. Henry sat on the edge of the living room chair, his usual composed demeanor softened by the modest surroundings. Across from him, Harold reclined in a worn armchair, his hands clasped tightly on his lap. Melissa stood near the window, arms crossed, her gaze alternating between the two men. The tension in the room was thick, the unspoken emotions nearly palpable. I owe you an apology, Mr. Carter, Henry began, his voice steady but tinged with regret. For everything. I should have been more involved, more aware of what was happening. You gave so much to the estate, and the way you've been treated is unacceptable. Harold tilted his head slightly, his expression a mixture of wariness and curiosity. An apology is one thing, he said slowly. But it doesn't change what's happened. 30 years, Mr. Cartwright. 30 years I gave to that place. Henry nodded, his throat tightening. And those years weren't forgotten. I've seen the gardens you tended, the beauty you cultivated. I let myself become detached. That's not an excuse, but it's the truth. I'm here because I want to make things right. Melissa, who had been silent until now, turned sharply toward him. Right? She repeated, her voice biting. Do you really think an apology and a check are going to fix this? My father's health has been spiraling, Henry. He's lost sleep, lost his sense of purpose. Do you have any idea what this has done to him? To us? Henry met her eyes, his own filled with emotion. I'm trying, Melissa. I know it doesn't erase what's happened, but I want to help. I want to prove to you, to both of you, that I'm still the person who cares. Her expression hardened. The person who cares? The Henry the First knew wouldn't have let this happen. The Henry the First knew wouldn't have been so caught up in his own world that he forgot about the people who make it run. The room fell into a heavy silence. Henry's shoulders sagged slightly, the weight of her words pressing down on him. He looked at Melissa, his voice softening. I lost my way, he admitted. When we were younger, I had dreams, ideals. But life pulled me in a different direction, and I let it. I thought success would fill the void, but it didn't. I've spent years trying to convince myself that I made the right choices, but when I saw your email, when I saw you, it was like being reminded of everything I once believed in. Melissa's jaw tightened, her defenses firmly in place. You don't get to come back here after all this time and act like that matters. You left, Henry. You let everything we had just slip away. Henry's gaze didn't falter. I didn't want to let you go, Melissa. I wrote to you. I tried to stay in touch, but your family moved so suddenly, and he stopped himself, running a hand through his hair. I should have tried harder. I should have found you. Her voice trembled, a mix of anger and lingering hurt. But you didn't. And now, after all these years, you think you can waltz back into my life and make amends with an apology? Harold cleared his throat softly, breaking the tension. Melissa, he said gently. Maybe we should hear him out. Melissa's eyes flicked to her father, then back to Henry. After a long pause, she stepped away from the window and sat down, though her posture remained guarded. Fine, she said. You have a lot to prove. Henry nodded, his expression resolute. I intend to. Starting now. The next morning, Henry returned to the estate. The sunlight filtering through the trees felt sharper, the air colder as he stepped out of his car. Inside the grand office, Ms. Delacroix sat at her desk, her expression turning to surprise, and then irritation, when Henry walked in unannounced. Mr. Cartwright, she began, standing quickly. I wasn't expecting. We need to talk, Henry interrupted, his tone firm. Now. He sat down across from her, his piercing gaze locking onto hers. I've reviewed the situation with Mr. Carter. The lawsuit is being dropped, effective immediately. Ms. Delacroix's eyes narrowed. Sir, with all due respect, the sculpture was an irreplaceable piece. There needs to be accountability. Accountability, Henry said sharply, does not mean ruining a man's life over an accident. Harold Carter gave 30 years to this estate. 30 years, Ms. Delacroix. And your response to a single mistake was to humiliate him and sue him? That's not how I want my properties managed. She hesitated, her lips pressing into a thin line. I was acting in the estate's best interest. No, Henry replied coldly. You were acting in your interest. And it ends now. Harold will be compensated for everything he's endured, including the medical costs this stress has caused. Ms. Delacroix's face flushed, but she didn't argue further. Henry stood, his voice calm but resolute. Your behavior doesn't align with the values I expect here. Consider this your final day at the estate. He left the office without another word, a weight lifting from his shoulders as he stepped outside. It was a small step, but it was a start. Over the next week, Henry worked tirelessly to make amends. He personally delivered a letter to Harold, outlining the compensation he would receive and formally inviting him back to the estate in whatever capacity he felt comfortable. Harold, though initially hesitant, began to soften. The sincerity in Henry's actions was undeniable. Meanwhile, Henry made frequent visits to the modest home, each one filled with quiet conversations and unspoken emotions. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Henry sat on the porch with Melissa. The silence between them was heavy but not uncomfortable. I don't expect you to forgive me, he said softly, breaking the stillness. But I hope you'll let me try to earn it. Melissa looked at him, her eyes searching his face. For the first time, she saw not the polished businessman, but the boy she had once loved. The one who had dreamed big and laughed freely. It's not that simple, she said quietly. You hurt me, Henry. And you hurt my father. But I see that you're trying. And I want to believe you. He smiled faintly, a flicker of hope in his eyes. Then that's enough for me. As the days passed, Harold began to recover, his spirits lifting as the weight of the lawsuit and his dismissal eased. Melissa found herself watching Henry with new eyes, catching glimpses of the man she had once loved. Slowly, cautiously, the walls between them began to crumble, replaced by the possibility of something new. The late afternoon sunlight spilled through the trees, casting a warm glow over the yard. Melissa stood near the flower bed, pulling out the last of the weeds with gentle precision. The garden had started to bloom again, small bursts of color dotting the earth, much like her life in recent weeks. She heard the sound of footsteps behind her and turned to see Henry approaching, his hands tucked into the pockets of his neatly pressed trousers. He looked different here, less like the polished businessman and more like the boy she had once known. You've done wonders with this, Henry said, motioning toward the flowers. It's beautiful. Melissa brushed her hands against her jeans, a small smile tugging at her lips. It's a work in progress, she replied. Kind of like everything else. Henry nodded, his gaze steady on her. I like progress. It means things are moving forward. There was a pause, the air between them charged but not uncomfortable. Melissa gestured toward the porch. Want to sit for a bit? It's cooler up there. They settled on the porch swing, the soft creak of the chains filling the quiet. For a moment, neither spoke, the easy rhythm of the swing carrying them. Henry glanced at her, his expression contemplative. Do you remember the first time we sat on a porch swing like this? He asked. Melissa tilted her head, a smile breaking through. At my parents' old house. You brought me ice cream, and it melted before we could eat it because we were too busy talking. Henry chuckled, the sound deep and familiar. I don't even remember what we talked about. I just remember how it felt. Like the world had shrunk down to just the two of us. Melissa looked down at her hands, her smile fading slightly. I used to think about those moments all the time, she admitted. When life got hard, I'd wonder what it would have been like if things had gone differently. Henry's voice softened. I thought about you too, more than I probably should have. I told myself it was in the past, that you were better off without me. But then I'd see something, a flower, a book, and I'd wonder if you were out there, if you were happy. Melissa turned to face him, her eyes searching his. And now? Now, he said, his voice steady, I know that no matter how far apart life takes us, some connections don't fade. And seeing you again, being here, it's made me realize how much I missed. Her breath caught at the raw honesty in his words. There was no pretense, no polished exterior. Just Henry, vulnerable and open, the way he had been all those years ago. It scared her, how easily he could still reach her heart, but it also felt right. I've missed you too, she said softly. But, Henry, this isn't just about us. There's so much history, so much hurt. I'm not the same girl you fell in love with. And I'm not the same boy, he replied. We've both changed, Melissa. But maybe that's not a bad thing. Maybe it means we've learned what really matters. She looked at him for a long moment, the walls she had built around her heart slowly crumbling. It's not going to be easy, she said finally. I'm not sure I even know how to do this anymore. Henry reached out, his hand covering hers. Then we'll figure it out together. One step at a time. The sound of the screen door creaking open broke the moment. Harold stepped out onto the porch, his movements steadier than they had been in weeks. He held a cup of tea in one hand, his expression warm as he looked at the two of them. Don't let me interrupt, he said with a knowing smile. I just thought I'd get some fresh air. Melissa stood and helped him to the swing, guiding him gently into the seat beside her. How are you feeling, Dad? Better, Harold said, his voice carrying a strength that had been absent for too long. Seeing this garden come back to life helps. And seeing the two of you, well, that's the best medicine I could ask for. Henry shifted slightly, his gaze earnest. Mr. Carter, Harold, I want you to know how much I admire you. For everything you've done, not just for the estate, but for Melissa. She's an incredible woman, and that's a reflection of you. Harold chuckled softly, shaking his head. You don't have to butter me up, Henry. I've seen enough to know when someone's heart is in the right place. And I can see you're trying to make things right. Melissa glanced at her father, her throat tightening. Dad. Harold raised a hand, cutting her off gently. You've been through enough, Melissa. It's time you let yourself be happy. If Henry is part of that happiness, then I'm all for it. Tears welled in her eyes as she leaned over to hug her father. Thank you, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. As the sun dipped lower, casting a golden hue over the porch, Henry took Melissa's hand once more. I'm not asking for anything except a chance, he said quietly. A chance to prove that I'm still the man who sat on that swing with you all those years ago. Melissa smiled through her tears, her heart finally letting go of the hurt and opening to the possibility of something new. Okay, she said softly. Let's see where this goes. The next Saturday, Henry arrived at Melissa's house with an armful of gardening supplies and a plan. Liam, curious about the man who had been visiting so often, peeked out from behind the living room curtains. Mom, he brought stuff, Liam said, his voice tinged with excitement. Is he staying? Melissa laughed, shaking her head as she led Liam outside. Henry thought we could work on the garden together. What do you think? Liam eyed the tools with interest, his curiosity overcoming his initial shyness. You mean, like planting flowers? Exactly, Henry said with a smile, crouching down to Liam's level. We could use someone who knows how to spot the best places to dig. Think you're up for the job? Liam nodded eagerly, his initial hesitation melting away as Henry handed him a small trowel. Melissa watched from the porch, her heart swelling as she saw the way Henry interacted with her son, patient, kind, and genuine. As the afternoon unfolded, the three of them worked side by side, laughter punctuating their efforts. Liam told Henry about his favorite books and his soccer games, his excitement growing with every word. Henry listened intently, asking questions and sharing stories of his own childhood adventures. Later, as the sun dipped low in the sky, Melissa sat on the porch swing, watching as Henry and Liam watered the freshly planted flowers. Liam's laughter echoed across the yard, and for the first time in years, Melissa felt a sense of completeness she hadn't known she was missing. When they finally sat down for dinner, Liam leaned over to Melissa, his voice quiet but confident. "Mom, I like him. He's funny. And he listens." Melissa smiled, her eyes meeting Henry's across the table. "I like him too, kiddo." The early evening sky glowed faintly as Melissa sat at the kitchen table with Henry, her son Liam upstairs reading a book. For the first time since Henry had reappeared in her life, the conversation turned to the years in between, the ones that had shaped who she was now. Melissa leaned back in her chair, her eyes distant but warm as she spoke. "After my parents moved us, I felt completely uprooted. I missed everything I'd known, our home, our friends, and," her voice softened. "You." Henry's gaze remained steady, his heart aching at the wistfulness in her voice. "I tried to find you, Melissa. I wrote letters, called the number you gave me. But nothing ever came back." She nodded slowly. "I know. My parents were struggling financially, and they wanted a fresh start. We ended up in a smaller town. I think my mom thought the distance would make it easier for me to let go of everything we left behind." "Did it?" Henry asked quietly. Melissa met his gaze. "Not for a long time. But life has a way of moving forward, doesn't it? I went to college, studied education, and started teaching right out of school. That's when I met Liam's father." Her expression shifted, a mixture of sadness and acceptance crossing her face. "It felt like the right thing at the time. He was charming, ambitious, and for a while, I thought we could build something meaningful together. But as time went on, his career always came first. Liam and I became afterthoughts. When Liam was 5, we divorced. He sees Liam occasionally, but we've built our life without him." Henry's chest tightened as he listened, imagining the strength it must have taken for Melissa to raise a child on her own while carrying the weight of her own dreams. "You've done an amazing job with Liam," he said. "He's bright, kind. It's clear how much he looks up to you." Melissa smiled faintly, though her eyes glistened. "He's my world. Everything I do for him." The warmth in her voice was matched by a flicker of uncertainty as she looked at Henry. "But now I wonder how he fits into this. Into us." Henry reached across the table, his hand covering hers. "We'll figure it out, Melissa. Together." A few days later, the roles reversed. This time, they sat on the porch as Henry opened up about his own path. Melissa listened intently, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea. "I threw myself into work after you left," Henry admitted, his voice tinged with regret. "I think, deep down, I thought if I stayed busy enough, I wouldn't feel the loss. I traveled constantly, built my business, collected art. But there were always moments when I'd see something and think of you. A song, a place, even the way sunlight hit a garden." Melissa tilted her head, her expression soft but inquisitive. "What about relationships? Did you ever?" Henry nodded slowly. "A few, here and there. But nothing serious. I think I kept people at arm's length, afraid of getting too close. And the truth is, no one ever felt like you." Her breath caught at his words, the the honesty in them cutting through the walls she had tried to keep up. "So you never married?" "No," Henry said, shaking his head. "I guess I thought I had all the time in the world. But time has a funny way of reminding you what you've lost." Melissa smiled gently, though her heart ached for the years they had both spent searching for something they couldn't name. "And now?" Henry leaned forward, his eyes meeting hers with quiet intensity. "Now I want to stop running. To stop building walls and start building something real. With you." Their lives began to intertwine more naturally after that day. Henry visited often, helping Melissa with projects around the house, attending Liam's soccer games, and becoming a steady presence in their lives. Harold watched the budding relationship with quiet approval, his heart full at the sight of his daughter smiling again. One evening, as they sat on the porch after dinner, Harold leaned toward Henry, his tone serious but warm. "You've done a lot for us, Henry. But more importantly, you've done a lot for Melissa. I can see how much she means to you, and I want you to know you have my blessing. Just don't let her down." Henry nodded, his voice steady. "I won't, Harold. Not this time." As the days turned into weeks, the house that had once felt too quiet began to fill with laughter and hope. Melissa, Henry, and Liam forged a new rhythm together, one built on trust, understanding, and a shared vision for the future. For Harold, it was the peace he had longed for, knowing his daughter was surrounded by love. And for Melissa, Liam, and Henry, it was the start of a future that, though uncertain, was full of promise. Together, they looked out at the garden, the blooms swaying gently in the breeze. It wasn't perfect, but it was theirs, a reflection of their past, their struggles, and the new beginning they were ready to embrace.